Irirai nai na nai 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 nai. Nai na nai nai na nai 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 nai. Irirai nai na nai nai. Hai nai na nai nai. Nai 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 no. Irirai rai 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 rai. Irirai rai 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 rai. Irirai rai 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 nai nai nam. Irirai nai 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 no. Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. Welcome today. And we're so happy to be in Elul, in this special month of Elul, learning together. We know some folks are still trickling in, but we wanted to start on time to honor all of your time. In session number 8, 10 Torah lessons on leadership, on empathy, and perspective taking. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this. But first, let's start with a quick poll question. Which do you find most difficult? Emotionally being empathetic, cognitively taking different perspectives, or imaginatively standing in someone else's life situation? Okay, those aren't completely separate from each other, but I think you get the point. Which of these do you find most difficult? Emotionally being empathetic, cognitively taking different perspectives, or imaginatively standing in someone else's life situation? Give you a few more seconds here. Okay, very interesting. A very Jewish group that our cognition is fully intact, right? We are good at the Talmudic mind of taking different viewpoints, but it can be for 60% more challenging to really imagine yourself as a different person that's totally different from you. And for 40%, being empathetic on an emotional level. Okay, beautiful. Leadership requires the ability to think from multiple perspectives. When those in positions of leadership are completely in their own heads, disinterested in what other people think, a disconnect is inevitable, and hurting or alienating others is a likely outcome. To successfully lead, we need to be able to inhabit the perspectives of others on 3 levels: the emotional, i.e. practicing empathy, the cognitive, i.e. understanding different points of reasoning, and that of identity, acknowledging that we come from different places. As always, here we see from the text, God is an inspiration. In Exodus 2, God models this approach to leadership in how God engages with the Israelites in slavery. We are told that in their bondage in Egypt, the Israelites cried out for help. In response, the text says, God heard their moaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. God saw the Israelites and knew them, saw them and knew them. The italics here are my own, of course, included to draw attention to the verbs being used in this passage. It's notable that we see 4 verbs here, where it would seem just one would be fine. Surely the meaning of the text would have been perfectly clear had it just said, for example, God heard them. But the Bible offers us 4 verbs: heard them, remembered them, saw them, and knew them. What are we to make of this? Well, traditional Jewish hermeneutics teaches that Torah is intentional, not written with flaws, but imparted by Moses from God. And if the document is assumed to be not superfluous, but everything intentional, then we cannot assume that the text is pointlessly repeating itself. Rather, we assume that what seems redundant is actually meaningful. Whether or not you believe in the divine origins of Torah, it's a helpful interpretive impetus to assume that the text we are reading has more to offer than just a first glance would suggest. In this tradition, I'm going to embrace that each of the 4 verbs used in this verse has something unique to teach us. God heard. The act of listening is more than merely physiological. In Hebrew, the verb we translate as to hear, lishmoa, also means to understand, right? That's, we have different words in English, but in Hebrew, lishmoa means to hear, but it also means to understand. When we are in positions of leadership, we need to not only listen to alternative viewpoints, but truly hear them. God remembered, secondly, the medieval Italian commentator, Rabbi Abbadia ben Yaakov Sforno, links this utterance to Genesis 17:7, when God renames Abraham and forms a covenant with him and his lineage, including us. I remember this honoring of a relationship and the mutual obligations that come with the relationship. We see here as leaders, we must remember that leadership is a two-way collaboration between us and those in our charge. God saw, God knew. How is knowing different than seeing? Well, it would seem both verbs suggest that God recognizes the suffering of the Israelites. Rashi tells us that when Torah says God knew, it really means God directed the divine heart to Bnei Yisrael. To know is an even deeper acknowledgement than to see. In fact, the very etymology of the English verb acknowledge is etymologically entwined with the verb to know. To acknowledge a person or group of people requires we go a step further in our seeing them to truly know them. With this powerful model in mind, I'd like to dive into three distinct approaches to shifting perspectives as leaders. 1, the emotional, 2, the cognitive, and 3, identity-based. First, perspective shifts on the emotional level. So many of the social ills that we experience as a society are the result of an inability or unwillingness to let ourselves imagine what others are feeling. Generally speaking, the word empathy refers to the experience of being sensitive to those feelings. When one engages in moral leadership, one must be committed to the process of engaging empathetically, even if this is not always comfortable. After all, empathy requires that to some extent, we put our feelings aside and allow ourselves to be affected by the feelings of another. There's a true vulnerability in that, and many of us know, and as many of us know, there are few endeavors sometimes scarier than this type of vulnerability. That said, I'd like to push back against the commonly held idea that empathy requires passivity. The way people often talk about empathy, we might picture ourselves sitting there quietly and meekly, listening with great deference while the other person speaks. But as we discussed last week, and so many of you even suggested, true listening is not a passive act. In fact, Steve, I'm thinking in particular about your point about responding. It is more like a dance in that it requires active engagement on the part of both parties, not just the speaker. In order to practice empathy, we want to ask questions about why people feel what they feel. We should feel in a spirit of curiosity, not as grilling. We should feel interested in the answers, and we should demonstrate that interest. In the world of conflict resolution, that is referred to as effective listening. It includes practices for maintaining and demonstrating attentiveness. Everything from holding eye contact to interjecting in order to confirm you have understood the intentions of the speaker. I was on a call last night about protecting democracy and how we could be poll chaplains and we could attend election sites and to combat intimidation and things like that. And one guy was like, oh, no one's going to intimidate me at the polls because I'm a 350-pound Marine veteran, 6'3", and, if anyone messes around at the polls, I'll get in their face. And so it's easy for me. And then one kind of physically smaller woman was like, look, it's really not about size and physical intimidation. She's like, I once saw, a Trumpist and an anti-Trumpist about to brawl at a poll site. And I stepped in and I commented on how beautiful their shirts were. Oh, you have such a beautiful shirt you're wearing. Oh, I love your clothes today too. And totally de-escalating that moment. And so too, sometimes when people are hot-headed, showing that you see them, showing that you hear them, showing that you, find something good in them can sometimes radically de-escalate a moment. In fact, sometimes I go a little too personal, but you're all friends, so it's. But with Shoshana, oftentimes, there's something's escalating, there's a disagreement, and I'm like, oh, like put on boxing gloves. And all of a sudden, she just says something kind to me. It's always her. It's never me who de-escalates. She says something kind to me, and I'm like, oh, like why was I looking to argue right now? You know what I mean? Just totally like reducing the temperature, and it's just who she is. It's not, in like some strategy. In any case, this is true in election time. Like if we're in a group space where we see things are heating up, a little bit of kindness, a little bit of seeing people, a little bit of hearing people can really change that space. Some people love conflict, and so they want to heat up that space. And maybe that's what some of us here too, but if we can move out the entertainment aspect and actually bring in more dignity to the space, we can think about how in election in less than 60 days, we can play a role in that. Not just of fighting for truth, although we should fight for truth, but also of de-escalating. Anyways, because empathy is an active practice, it can be cultivated. The field of childhood development is deeply concerned with encouraging the nascent empathy in children so that they can grow into adults capable of lasting, meaningful connections. To some extent, empathy is an instinct. Experts note that in childhood, empathy tends to increase on average as children get older and better equipped to understand the perspectives of others. In fact, even toddlers show the ability to respond empathetically. Interestingly, empathy tends to decrease in early adolescence, especially in cases of perceived difference. Happy to share the links to those if you're interested in reading those studies. Those invested in the development of children, from teachers to parents to academics on the subject to grandparents, recognize that children and adolescents need help if they are to enhance their ability to engage empathetically. Popular techniques include having children initially focus on their own feelings and then exploring the similarities between their feelings and the feelings of others, as well as participating in role-playing exercises in order to imagine how someone else is feeling. Adults must also model empathy for children by engaging sincerely in the feelings of a child. Later today, the child is coming back to my office. Last week, a Jewish mother brought her 3.5-year-old to my office and said, "I cannot handle this boy. I want to put him up for adoption. Can you find me a Jewish family for him? His severe ADHD is something I can't handle." And fast forward, a lot of late night phone calls for me, and I now have 2 families coming to visit that child later today in the office to see if they're good matches for him. And given that she used a lot of hard drugs during the pregnancy, that obviously has an impact. But having talked to behavioral therapists, they've also reflected on how much less alarming that is than alcohol, with fetal alcohol syndrome. And one of the things that's scary about some of that impact is actually when a child is unable to cultivate empathy and unable to attach. Because of a substance abuse issue. And that's one of the things I'm going to look for in this child today is, yes, that is a fair question, because many people think that 3.5 is way too early to diagnose ADHD. Other people think you can. Other people think it's too early. In any case, the PTSD is very real also, given his current, situation. So yeah, I think that I'm interested to see if he's able to see people and respond, and if that can, how that can be cultivated. So anyways, long story, but just thought I'd bring that in since we're talking about child development. Even as adults, we must continue to think of empathy as a practice to cultivate rather than a purely innate ability. Only by developing the skill of empathy are we able to see a situation through someone else's eyes and truly understand their perspective. The goal is to reach a place where we don't merely tolerate differences, but celebrate difference. In the words of the great philosopher Martin Buber, I wish his otherness to exist because I wish his particular being to exist. if we were to look for sameness as opposed to otherness, we erase people. We erase people's uniqueness. When we see people's uniqueness, we help give them existence, and integrity and authenticity in that. The truth is that being able to entertain points of view other than our own doesn't just make us better people, it makes us better leaders. And that moves us into number 2, from the emotional to perspective shifts on the cognitive level. So friends, in the realm of the cognitive, we practice the ability to understand different ways of reasoning. The ability to see arguments and problems from multiple points of view is a necessity for leadership, as it prevents us from becoming fixed in our ways and missing opportunities. Encountering other ways of thinking can also save us from radicalization. In his book on the topic, Going to Extremes, How Like Minds Unite and Divide, Harvard law professor Cass Sunstein shows that those who associate solely with others who share their views tend toward extremism over time. It is up to us to curtail our own natural inclination towards sameness, one that can lead to formulaic and unoriginal thinking, and expose ourselves to a variety of viewpoints. I don't want to talk too much about politics, but I'm always very impressed with politicians who build a team of people who will challenge them and people who really are diverse in their thinking. And that of course, is not just politics. That's any organization. That's any type of group. And also people who have some friends who are thoughtful and diverse in being thoughtful. There are countless examples of successful political leaders practicing cognitive perspective shifts. A particularly heartening one comes to us from the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. During a time of incredible strife and division, when the nation was at war with itself, President Lincoln sought out the opinions of his opponents rather than shunning them. American historian Doris Kearns Goodwin has noted how Lincoln made the daring choice of bringing together his political rivals, people who disagreed with him on fundamental issues, to create a team that together could tackle the divisive issue of slavery that had sparked the Civil War. It's kind of hard to imagine today, right? But literally, his most fierce opponents, bringing them into this strategy. For examples of cognitive perspective shifts from within the Jewish world, we might turn to the concept of chavruta, the long-standing tradition of undertaking Torah study in pairs. This practice is attested to in the Talmud itself. In a teaching from Rabbi Elazar, conveyed by Rabbi Yirmiyah, we learn 2 Torah scholars who sharpen one another in halakha, the Holy One, be blessed, ensures success for them. The verb sharpen is interesting here, recalling perhaps Proverbs 27, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the wit of his friend. So a person sharpens the wit of their friend. We sharpen our positions by engaging with people who question us, challenge us, and even disagree with us. Sometimes our goal may be to defeat our opponent in debate. Other times we may seek to arrive at a compromise. The Talmudic term for compromise is peshara. Emerging from the Jewish legal system, the concept of peshara is greatly respected. The 19th century Talmudist Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik praises peshara as a socially healing approach to conflict. Right, and where he writes, in peshara, social harmony is the primary concern. Whether or not you come to a compromise, simply the act of engaging with contrary viewpoints helps us to clarify our own positions. What matters is that in leadership, we do not want to be surrounded only by people who think like us. Rather, we want to build a team around us filled with diverse thinking that allows people to challenge each other, or in the words of the Talmud, to sharpen each other's minds. Okay, number 3, perspective shifts on the level of identity. While it is true that we all have our own unique feelings and ideas, the issue of identity considers each person as, in part, product of their context. We truly all come from very different places. We have different genes and memories and races and cultures and genders and sexual orientations and socioeconomic statuses. We have bodies with differing abilities. These markers shape us and shape our perspectives. If we can't imagine the experiences created by holding identities different than our own, or at least acknowledge that some element of our own perspective is shaped by our own identity and our relative proximity to power, then we will remain stuck in our own perspectives. One of the most common ones of toxic political discourse today is to assume that the person on the far opposite end of you is merely filled with hate. This is merely if you're pro-life, you hate women, right? If you support, police officers over the arguments of police brutality, you're racist, right? You hate Black people. If you are opposed to some Israel policies, you're an anti-Semite. And it goes on, and and obviously the opposite side too. And so, yes, there is a lot of hate out there, and that's real, and we should not be naive about it. And yet, how can we also understand why some people might land politically where they land based on their cultural upbringing? Which is very different than justifying or agreeing with the approach as much as compared to just trying to understand why people believe what they believe. It's important to remember that we can't assume one element of someone's identity based on another. Someone's physical ability does not anticipate their gender. Someone's race does not indicate their socioeconomic status, and so on. Of course, we learn from our encounters and develop sensitivities that help us interact more respectfully with traditionally marginalized groups. When I'm invited to enter into an Asian home, for example, I might be sure to take off my shoes without putting my host in a position of asking me. However, we must also remember that each person is unique. Part of this perspective taking is a twofold contemplation. When I encounter someone who has clear identity differences from me, I must both tap into my past learning about people similar to them, but also engage in inquiry and humble curiosity without making assumptions about their experiences or perspectives. As we are reminded in the ethical teachings of Pirkei Avot, do not judge your fellow until you have reached their place. In more familiar wording, we might say, don't judge another until you've been in their shoes. Acknowledging differences in experience and using our empathetic imaginations to make the experiences of others feel real to us is a hallmark of personal growth and effective leadership. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote about our new era of interpretation. He wrote, the spread of post-truth then has much to do with the new media of instantaneous global communication, but it also has a wider intellectual context. The first relates to the work of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, given a generic name by Paul Ricoeur as the hermeneutics of suspicion. This was the idea that beneath any apparent communication, something else is going on. There's a subtext here. For Marx, it was the powerful concretizing their power. For Nietzsche, it was the weak taking their revenge against the strong. For Freud, it was the subterranean currents of unconscious desires. But for all three of them, what was said was less important than what was beneath what was said. Truth was a mere mask, concealing the realities of power. Wow, there's a lot of truth to that, and also some problem, potentially. There's a benefit to being able to challenge and reinterpret texts by seeing the full dynamics involved. But there's also a loss in our suspicion of others, that no one can be taken literally. Who can we believe anymore when everything is a power game, power struggle? Everything is to be suspect. Is everyone just communicating their truths based on power moves for self-gain? Our curiosity about others, rather than our suspicion of them, is well articulated by Heschel. For Heschel, we can get off to the wrong start in the very phrasing of the question. We ask, what is man? Yet the true question should be, who is man? As a thing, man is explicable. As a person, he's both a mystery and a surprise. As a thing, he is finite. As a person, he is inexhaustible. By the way, when there's an ancient text, I go gender neutral because you can just translate it that way. When there's a modern text where someone says man and he, it feels unfair to them to change their wording because they wrote in English. So, I'm sorry that in the 20th century, people still referred to humans as man, but I hope that's okay for folks. But I can understand why the text can be alienating in that sense. All that being said, there's an argument to be made against accounting for differences in identity. Consider the context of a court of law. Shouldn't justice be impartial? Nobody would want separate legal codes for people with disabilities, for example. That would be dehumanizing. The Torah is clear on this matter. You should do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor, it says Leviticus 19:15. Meaning we judge the act done by the person, not the identity of the person who committed the act. Indeed, in some cases, overly empathizing with a certain group might end up doing an injustice in a context where impartiality is required. Certain instances of this are obvious. For example, it's problematic if I, as a man, sympathize more with men. Other instances are less obvious. For example, let's say you're someone who makes special accommodations for marginalized groups. Well, in the context of a social justice setting, this is an effective and necessary instinct. However, in the context of procedural justice setting, this might be a problem. In the same vein, we might consider the limitations of empathy itself. As humans, we need a lot of faculties. Empathy is just one of them. Empathy can be debilitating. For example, a trauma surgeon who constantly practices radical empathy might find herself completely overloaded emotionally when she tries to operate on a patient. She might be so overcome with vicarious pain for the patient that she can't focus on the task at hand. It's easy to attack principles as cold, especially in an era when far-right rallying cries include the absurd idea of caring about facts, not feelings. Of course, we're not fully human if we don't care about the feelings of others. But the truth is, we must find a balance, a pshara, if you will, between principles and feelings, between reasoning and empathy. I also want to be clear that changing perspectives is not an act of weakness. It's an act of profound bravery on both sides. We've discussed this story in the past, but I want to share it again because it's so powerful. One of the most profound examples of such bravery comes to us from 1972, when Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American congresswoman, changed the heart of the ardent segregationist George Wallace. As governor of Alabama, Wallace had run on a ticket of racial segregation, pledging segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was violently against any integration between Black and white students. He famously attempted to physically block the first Black students from enrolling at the University of Alabama. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described him as perhaps the most dangerous racist in America today. Things changed drastically for Wallace when in 1972, an assassination attempt was made on him as he campaigned for presidency. He survived but was shot several times. While he was in the hospital recovering, he was visited by a fellow politician who stood for everything Wallace seemingly hated, Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman to sit in Congress. She was outspoken in her advocacy for African Americans and other racial minorities. She championed racial and gender equality. Not only were Wallace and Chisholm political rivals, both seeking nominations in the 1972 presidential race, but Wallace's politics actively dehumanized Chisholm. And yet, against the advice of her staff, in an incredible act of bravery, Chisholm visited the segregationist. When she said to him was simple, "I wouldn't want what happened to you to happen to anyone." In response, he wept. Wallace's daughter, Peggy, credits Chisholm's courageous visit with effecting a change of heart in her father. In fact, Chisholm and Wallace found they had a fair amount in common when it came to their views on economic justice. 2 years after the fateful visit, he was rallying behind Chisholm to pass her bill on raising the minimum wage for domestic workers. By 1982, Wallace had completely renounced his views on segregation. In 1989, he again successfully ran for governor of Alabama. During that final term, he appointed more than 160 Black members of state governing boards and was part of efforts to the number of African Americans registered to the vote. Wallace's journey of redemption began with the courage of Shirley Chisholm, who chose to engage with her opponent. In doing so, she not only changed him, but changed history. Although we would all like to imagine ourselves as Chisholm, the one standing to the right on the right side of history, we must admit that we all have blind spots. To some degree, we have all been in the position of Wallace. Breaking through our bigotries requires a willingness to change and a willingness to listen to the very people who trigger us. Conversely, when we are in the position of being oppressed by the bigotry of others, we must acknowledge that we cannot expect people to understand us if they have never encountered us. Naturally, we do not want to put an unfair burden on people to humanize themselves to bigots. Often it's not safe to do so. If we are in a position of leadership, as Chisholm was, and we have the opportunity to engage with people we feel opposed to, perhaps even people who hate us, the results may be powerful. So much hate comes from ignorance. For those of us who are hated, if we are able to be just a little more proximate, some of that hate can fall away. I think of some of my colleagues, Israeli settlers, who are still doing peace dialogue work with religious Gazans. Actually, sorry, not Gazans. I mean, some degree of communication, but mostly religious Muslims in the West Bank. And how can you, amidst the most unimaginable tensions and disagreements, continue to talk, continue to be proximate? When perspectives clash, we get conflict. One of the most powerful ways to diffuse conflict, perhaps even reach a resolution, is to approach the situation humbly and with curiosity about the opposing point of view. In my own life, I've found that a genuine question can do so much in diffusing a situation. For example, asking what the other person's ideal outcome would look like. What does your ideal outcome look like in this situation? I'm not alone in this finding. Dr. Danya Rumor, director of the Environmental Dispute Resolution Program in the Wallace Stegner Center at the University of Utah, notes that we need to bring a keen, careful, and inquisitive interest to our conversation partner in a conflict. Deep problems arise when we make assumptions about the other person's interests and fears. We might, Dr. Danya Rumor writes, be carrying the assumption that one person is at fault or that the conflict must end in a win-lose situation. Remaining curious about the perspectives of others, as well as about the possibilities for the conflict itself, paves the way to resolution. By the way, I think it's so dangerous to only view the November election as a win-lose. Either my people win or my people lose. That is a very important part of it, very important part. But the second part is what happens in the country, the culture of a country after an election. Up until now, I've been addressing perspective taking across huge divides. However, we also need empathy and perspective taking in loving relationships where the divides will be much smaller. We sometimes leave empathy and perspective taking for those huge differences, but it also matters where we have small differences. Small divides are by no means insignificant. In fact, they are necessary, if difficult, facet of intimacy. The philosopher Ilham Dilman writes that separateness in love is far from being a goal and is in fact a necessary condition of friendship, love, and human give and take. The differences between us, the very conditions that require empathy to bridge, make love possible. Dilman further writes, I cannot really love someone with whom I have identified myself to the extent that I do not feel her to have an identity apart from mine. Sometimes a child, a spouse, a sibling, we think of ourselves as one mind, but that's sometimes a disservice. We began this inquiry with a verse from Torah. The Israelites cry out to God. God responds, God heard their moaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites and knew them. To some extent, the entirety of this discussion on perspective shifting is contained in these lines from Exodus, which models the empathetic, the cognitive, and the identity-based modes of perspective shifting. When God hears the distress of the Israelites, is that not kind of a divine effective listening, which is to say the practice of empathy? When God remembers the covenant, this is a recommitment to the partnership with Bnei Yisrael. If the Charuta method of studying is a cognitive partnership in learning, then the covenant between God and the Jews is a cosmic partnership across time. When God sees the Israelites in the story, God recognizes each person both as part of the religious ethnic group, Bnei Israel, and as individuals also, each with a completely distinct spirit. God sees us in the fullness of our identity, but not purely in terms of our identity, exactly as we should endeavor to see others. Friends, to conclude, the final verb in our quoted verse here was to know, that God knew them. I believe we can understand this line as a culmination of the previous three. The verse shows us that we can come to know each other through listening, remembering, and seeing. By listening with our hearts, remembering the value of others' reasoning, and seeing each person as both part of culture and utterly individual, we are able to reach a place of true knowing. This is a perspective shift. By shifting our perspective, we are able to know, to some extent, what the person opposing us knows. We are able to finally stand in their shoes and walk with them. Okay, friends, that was very long-winded. I'm sorry, but I would love to open up our conversation. And it's nice that we have a smaller group today.
So I'll start back at the beginning when you asked if we should ask why someone feels the way they feel. And I immediately bristled because asking that question could be seen as a challenge to someone having feelings. And so for me, again, from that nonviolent communication perspective, trying to understand what needs of theirs aren't being met, i.e., what is it that they value that is not being experienced? And for me, that's where the curiosity piece comes in, is trying to ferret that out and to make sure that I never assume that I know what it is that they are needing or what value it is. I can question, like, is it this? Is it that? But I learned early, when in a group, I suggested to someone that I knew how they felt, she just exploded. And that was such a great lesson for me, because I don't know how someone else feels. No matter how close our path is, how close the experience she's relating to, none of that matters. I don't know. And that's that beautiful piece of humility again. Anava is key, I think, to our being able to be empathic. Let me see, is there anything else that I really wanted to say? No, I think that's kind of it. That some of the best leaders I've ever known are the most vulnerable in terms of their own experience, and the ones who carry the most chesed and anava. That just being humble, having your heart wide open, and really being able to hear and see the other is, I think, one of the most valuable things we can do as a leader. I'm done.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that. Thank you for all that wisdom on nonviolent communication and the various midot character traits involved with this type of communication. And I really appreciate the point also of how certain types of questions that are meant to demonstrate empathy may be viewed as challenging. In particular, the one that I shared. And I also really appreciate the point that sharing with people that we know exactly.
I am.
That sharing exactly what people are, that we understand exactly what people are feeling, might actually be invalidating.
Okay, yeah, bye-bye.
And and yeah, and that's my experience as well, that we always want to acknowledge that there never is a perfect understanding. There is always an otherness, going back to that Buber point, even if we understand a lot, that we never have walked in someone's shoes, even if we're trying to. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Matthew. Hi, Matthew.
Hi. So an interesting comment. Years ago, Channel 4, NBC News in New York used to start out the evening local news. Here Now the News. And was it HERE as these are the facts, or was it HEAR, listen and make and try and understand? And what was interesting, they were asked about it, and the newscaster once said, it's up to you to figure out. It's not in the teleprompter. So it's not that I'm giving you facts, I'm giving you information, and you have to hear it and process it and make certain decisions. It was an interesting comment. And the other phrase was News for New York, and it was Channel 4. So was it FOUR or News for FOR? So the ability at all times to listen and really hear what people are saying. And more importantly, to hear what they're not saying. And because sometimes people are afraid to speak, sometimes they're ashamed to speak, sometimes they don't value their opinion. And when someone is silent, that also says something to you, and you should listen very carefully to someone's silence.
Yes, very nice. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And that ability to hear in that way what someone's saying and what they're not saying, and how we to pick up on how we make someone feel based on how we're listening. There's a phrase that's grown in popularity a lot in recent years for called gaslighting. And a big part of what gaslighting is about is, well, abuse might be too harsh of a word in some more mild cases, but it's a type of emotional abuse if someone's consistently gaslighting, where one is kind of manipulating intentionally or unintentionally someone, constantly question whether their own truth is true. Like, are my feelings real? Are my thoughts real? Are my memories real? Kind of undermining someone's own experience in a sense. And it is easy to go down that path. So Matthew, do you want to add anything there?
No, I was just thinking about the not saying something can be an incredibly powerful message. And you remember the book Rise and Fall, The Third Reich by William Shirer?
I never read that.
Okay. When the Germans were ready, quote, to invade England, they took all the reporters to Belgium to look at the troops. And they were going to allow them to write stories. And Shirer, who was a brilliant reporter, spoke to the U.S. naval attachés and said, what do I look for? And the naval attaché's comment was, I don't care how many troops they have. Do they have any boats to get them across the English Channel? And they had no boats where the troops were. There was no way to get them across. And the Germans kept pressuring Shirer to file a report the way every other reporter did about the number of troops. And he wrote something that got past the censors. And his editors knew what he said. And their headline was, lots of troops, but no way to get across the channel. So sometimes it's what's not said that is the most important lesson. And we have to listen, and we have to listen carefully to people when they don't talk.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sometimes just saying, tell me more, is the way to proceed, because it's non-judgmental and it invites more communication.
How do folks feel about sharing when someone is going vulnerable, sharing one's own vulnerability as a way to kind of equal the playing field, so to speak? I can imagine someone feeling like, this is not about you, don't bring in your stuff. And I can imagine the other side of saying that the other person feels more comfortable because we're both sharing our vulnerabilities. Curious to hear how folks relate to that. Judy shaking your head. Yeah, say more.
I don't like, yeah, tell me more, right? I think that it immediately equates what your experience has been with what they have. And I think that can be belittling in some ways, or it creates a sense that you think you understand when you may not yet. And I think if you put it in terms of such and such happened to me, is that what you're talking about?
Well, let's say, for example, someone says, Judy, I'm really struggling. My father has cancer. And you say, I want to learn, I want to hear more about that. And I can relate to some degree because 10 years ago, my father had cancer or something like that, you know?
Right, right. I think that is a more universal kind of experience than many that are presented. And maybe that would be an exception to my general rule. But I've just heard it done in so many ham-handed ways that I'm skeptical that that's a good starting point. I think maybe it's something that can be reached later in a conversation once you have a better sense. You could say, when my parent had cancer, I found it very helpful to enlist hospice early on. And I know many people don't think of that. Something to that effect, which shows that you may be offering something, but you also are open to the possibility that that person doesn't find that of use. So if you do it with a lot of humility, perhaps, but as a general rule, I don't think it's such a great idea.
So I want to, no, I want to open it up a little more because I think I'm just trying to find clarity for myself on where it's appropriate and where it's a hindrance. Where one can find a common ground, they feel they can share more deeply with someone because they're more trusted, because they have some shared value or experience, and where it gets in the way. So someone comes out of the closet to someone, and they say, well, actually, I'm gay too. And and maybe not the very first thing they say, but at some point say, like, to build a common ground. Someone says, I had a miscarriage a month ago, and the woman says, well, I once had a miscarriage also. Is finding that commonality of experience, something that, or a Black person talks about an act of racism, how it affected them, and the Jewish person talks about how an act of anti-Semitism kind of once hurt them. Very different. So I'm curious, like, where does it feel like it gets in the way, and where does it feel like it builds a bridge?
I think part of it is how well the people know each other. I think, like I said, if you approach it with humility and you say, this may not be a great analogy, but when this happened to me, this was how I approached it. Obviously a miscarriage is kind of a one-on-one, but we just don't know a lot of what goes on with people's struggles. And I think if someone opens up to you and says, my child just came out to me, I'm not sure what to do. There are resources, there are people, it so much depends on A, how much you know each other, and B, what that experience is like, and C, how kind you can be and continue listening. Because sometimes when you go into your own story, you have a way of stop listening. So
yeah, interesting. Thank you, Judy.
I've spoken too much.
No, it's great. Steve or Jeff, either of you want to jump in? Oh, sorry, Steve, still on mute there. I guess it didn't click off yet.
Awesome. Actually, that's symbolic of what I was just going to say. I wanted to thank Matthew and Judy for their comments. Matthew acknowledging that there is a message in one's silence, and there I was on mute the whole time. And Judy saying, tell me more. I I know the pain of being silent because I've been a relatively silent person most of my life. And only recently have I found out what I think were the reasons. And one was, I think the important reason was that my dad was super sensitive to the possibility of Nazis coming to the United States. After they had murdered his parents, he said, don't rock the boat. Keep a low profile. Don't say anything. Do your job and let that speak for you. And so I've been, until recently, or now I talk too much, a very silent person, afraid that what I say might expose me to someone who is out to get me. Not so anymore. And so thank you, Matthew. That was very, very interesting perspective that you brought to light. I was so silent, in fact, that right after I got married, I gave a speech, and my aunt came over to me and said, "My God, I didn't even know you could talk. I never heard you say a word in all of my life." And so silence is not necessarily putting somebody else down. A lot of people think that when you're silent, you're ignoring them, you have disdain for what they have to say, you're putting them down. It might be something else. And so it's not my silence that I want to talk about. It is give the moment a chance. Let the moment speak for itself. Don't draw on the past history too much of your relationship. And Judy, tell me more. I always say that to you. Tell me more, because you have put me on. You have drawn me through the paths of darkness more often than you know. I'm sort of rambling on now, but I love the stuff about silence. There is a huge, huge message in it. May I say one more thing, please, and then I'll keep quiet. I wasn't really filled with happiness regarding that Exodus part that you showed in the beginning. God remembered. What do you mean God remembered? God, you should be knowing this every second of the day. What do you mean you remembered? Did you forget at some time? And so with that, I'd like to pose what might be an arrogant question. Is or what is God a good leader? And that's it.
Awesome. That is a great question. The reality of whatever God is or where God is, and actually being a good leader is a question we could bracket. But the God of the Torah, the stories we read, the God that is portrayed to us through this tradition, is this a good leader? Interesting enough, I think it's a passing question, but God never asks us to, kind of follow the lead as much as walk with. But yeah, is God able through legislation or through persuasion to convince the people to live a better life? And is God today is the force of God today inspiring more goodness or more vice in the world today, as practiced from all the religions, from all humanity? Is the idea of God producing more good or harm? And that's a fair question to ask. Just as one of the questions to assess our own moral leadership is, am I producing more good or harm by the ways I engage in the world, by the things I consume, the things what I produce and the like? And good point, Judy. Be holy because I'm holy sounds like leadership. And those are huge questions, and I thank you for that. But one of the things I was thinking of, and I hope other people will engage with that question also, whether it's this or in our last two sessions, one of the things I was thinking about in regards to you being silent for a while in a very different context is James Earl Jones, who passed away last week, and the very well-known story about him, which I just assume is true because it's told so often, but I've never verified it, but that the person who became the voice of Mufasa and the voice of Darth Vader and really the most famous voice in America, one might say. Well, I feel like when I was a kid, it was Tom Brokaw. But as today, you know, that he was silent based on trauma from a young age up into through his teen years, truly silent, until his English teacher forced him to read his poem and pulled him out of that. And I would like to believe that actually that silence is actually what produced that voice, that a big part of the greatness of his voice, stutterer, thank you. Yes, that a trauma when he was 5 led to this stutter that led him to talk less, and that perhaps it was that going silent that actually produced that greatest voice in America. And so too with you, Steve, that hesitancy to speak earlier maybe was actually part of the great gift of great Steve Shobin's voice in the world today, and what it now produces for us each week. Yeah, Judy.
I think you don't always have to say something. You can often, when you're listening, you make what a friend of mine used to call little listening voices, little listening noises, like, you know, it's not an affirmation, it's not an objection, but you know, as someone's talking, that acknowledge that you're listening to them, and make sure that they know you're engaged, even though you're not going to say anything for the moment.
I love that. I love that. The only person I know who doesn't love that is my 7-year-old daughter, that when she talks and I go, she starts making fun of me. She goes, She can't stand when I'm giving my little noises. She thinks it's hilarious. She's like, why do you got to make those noises when I talk? But yes, I love that, Judy. Sarah, what were you going to say?
I'm going to say, and presence is really what we're asking for.
What is it?
Presence rather than words. Yeah. We really want someone's full presence with us. And that's really what empathy is about.
I love it. Thank you all. Thank you for sharing your wisdom today. And as people who inspire me towards trying to live with more empathy, I appreciate you all and wish you a beautiful day. Look forward to seeing you soon. God bless.